Okay, this is episode 9 of Narrative Wake, a show sponsored by esports pools. And the thing about esports pools that I've always enjoyed, okay, is they even call it fantasy at the outset. You know, they let you know that even though they're using real things, they've created sort of a meta context around them that is the fantasy esports tournament. And what's great about the fantasy world is some things are actually quite counterintuitive. You know, like in the real game, you'll have some like really amazing player, but who maybe makes like you have a lot of top laners like this, for example, where maybe they just get like 1 or 2 very decisive kills that switch the game into their favor, and then they win the game from that, you know. But that's not actually going to kind of rack up stats in the same way as, for example, you know, classic Season 4, Season 5 Reckless. Now, the good thing about Season 4, Season 5 Reckless is I know from tangible reality that he wasn't one of the world's best AD carries, and that was kind of a narrative that was played up by feckless people wearing black and orange jerseys, fans, obviously, no offense to the players of that team, and people who just really, really love, apparently, the white race, as far as I can tell. Like, it's just anyone not Korean or Asian. So, as far as I can tell, they're the people who mainly thought he was really good. But here's the thing, though. If you'd been able to play esports pools back then, and you'd have picked him, you would have won. He would have been one of the best players. So actually, you know what, Reckless? My apologies, son. In the world of fantasy esports, you were one of the best AD carries. Now, on that note, I've already triggered all the fan base that's about to watch this episode, because this is one of our special one-off episodes, which is on a specific topic. And what topic might that be, you ask? It is only going to be Season 5, Summer into Worlds FNATIC, the 18-0 into the playoff run where they won LCS and then they went to Worlds and they finished top 4. So obviously a team that on the one hand, very celebrated, but I also feel like actually as years have gone by, a little bit contentious. Like I feel like people actually cooled off on them a lot over the years, you know, and some people, I have to say, it feels like some people went so all in on them that when they then didn't make the final Worlds and didn't win Worlds, they had to sort of like take a break for a while, just distance themselves for a while, let FNATIC become just an okay team again, and they had to pretend like they never went all in. It's sort of like people in the West who supported communism, and they were like, no, if it just was tried correctly, and then when the Soviet Union fell, they were all like, no, I just meant like sort of democratic socialism or something, you know, like that's kind of what went on there. So usual host, Thorin, guy who triggers people by, usually it's the same joke, it's always about how, you know, some player you think's good is good in fantasy esports, but not in real life, haha. Obviously, idiots give me all the money. I mean, basically, that's sort of the script for my whole career. I just expand it out a bit, you know, pad it a little bit, put a bit of polish on it as well. Usual co-host, Kelsey Moser. I did actually tell her the wrong time for this show, and that has forced her to very quickly scramble and come here. So she does look like she's had her hair done in one of those sort of like a very coiffed manner, but that might just be because she had to just scramble and do the show out of nowhere. This is true?
I mean, I never really do anything to my hair, but people think I do, so we'll go with that, you know.
You know, by the way, I'm just going to go ahead and call them out right now. So everyone compliments Froskurin on her hair, right? First and foremost, I'll go ahead and tell you why that is, because you change the fucking color every 2 weeks. That's the whole point of why women change the color every 2 weeks. I learned this. What that's saying is, everyone around me, I just need a little bit of attention right now. No, nothing deep, nothing important. I don't need to get into my feelings or personality or who I am and, you know, flaws as a person and grow. Just can you all pay me a little bit of attention? Because I've done something a bit crazy. I've changed my hair color. So, first of all, that's one of the reasons you get the attention for Froskurin. And here's number 2, okay. People always ask Froskurin, they say, how do you get your hair styled like that? Because it always looks fantastic, you know, it looks very coiffed, like it's always like a very bizarre angle that like normally you'd need a lot of gel or something to put it like that. And she always says, proudly by the way, that she only washes it like every 2 weeks or something, right? I'm just going to go ahead and say this, right? That's nasty as fuck. That is nasty as fuck. So that might look amazing, but that is a fucking building with no foundation. So I'm just going to say that right there. Nothing to do with the show. Although I guess in a way it is, because actually, you know, Yellowstar was in Season 5 FNATIC. Obviously, Yellowstar and Froskurin, name a more iconic duo. You know, I'll wait. So our guest for this episode is Peter Dunne. Now, you're already thinking, who the fuck is that? Or maybe you're thinking, what has Peter done? Now, all you need to know about Peter Dunne is that everyone in the world has someone to make them feel better about themselves. So you know how when we had like a Baxial on this show, everyone was like, who we even, I vaguely remember, does it, I think like with TSM briefly or something, and then something in Brazil, I don't know. And then what happens is, I have to then explain to people, no, you actually have to understand, he's actually one of the most successful coaches ever to coach in Brazil. He coached for some of the biggest teams, including INTZ. So Abaxial has Peter Dunne to make himself feel better about himself, because he's like, well, I'm still famous, more famous than that guy. You know, he was an even less famous Western coach of INTZ, who's now trying to make it, hopefully. Just don't end up like Abaxial did now, because he tried to make that daring leap of faith. Listen, if you pull it off, it would be an incredible career move from Brazil to potentially, I mean, he wanted to be in FNATIC, you know, potentially be in North America somewhere. The problem is, the reason why it's a leap of faith is because you die in the chasm below you if you don't make it across. You do understand that, you know. It's not a rope bridge that you just walk across very carefully. It's a leap of faith. So you were a coach of INTZ, now trying to transition that into potentially somewhere else in the world, right?
Maybe, we'll see. But I did make the choice to go to Brazil.
Okay. I wasn't implied it was a prison that you were banished to, like Bane or something. You know? Like, I'm sure it was your own choice. Okay. Why did you go there, though?
It's just because back in the start of Season 6, the region was extremely popular, had a very passionate fan base, but was sort of looking to make the next step to develop to sort of have a more complex coaching infrastructure and sort of strategic knowledge about the game. So I went, and you can see the impact now. Team 1 are at Worlds, being slammed by all the commentators for not being very good mechanically, but they understand how to play the game. They have good macro.
That's all that matters. So, that's the most important factor, right?
That's all that matters.
So the context of why we have Peter here for this particular episode is that Kelsey knows a lot of perverts, right? People who actually literally just enjoy for fun watching League of Legends, sometimes without any sort of like content creation to get money out of it. They legitimately love that shit, you know? People who just like write down stats manually by hand, watch all the VODs, make timestamps of things for themselves. I'm sure in their minds they think to themselves, oh, these notebooks one day will be really important. I can use this for research. They never do. You know, they will, put it this way, they will die alone. Those notebooks will die alone, and that will be the end of everyone's life. And listen, it's a thankless task, but every now and then it bears fruits. And today it bears fruits because Peter here did VOD review a number of the games from that era. So unlike most people who, by the way, a lot of people who watched the games back then, one of the things I've always preached is you actually have to go back and watch VODs from the past. You can't just trust the fact that, well, I watched it at the time. Like you won't remember it because your brain actually, believe it or not, as it's sort of deleting the memories, goes ahead and sort of makes a shorthand. Like, well, you know roughly how they played that way and this player played that way. The memories just start to slip away, you know. So someone who's actually watched the games, you know, hopefully we'll have an in-depth understanding here, or maybe we'll be able to point out some nuance beyond things like that Reckless was a clean-up Eddie carry, insert joke. Like, you know, I'll mainly be handling that part, Peter. Leave the clean-up Eddie carry jokes to me, mate. So where we'll start is this, right? How much actually did you watch during that season? Like, what was the context of why you did some VOD reviews? Were you actually studying them the whole way? How did that come about?
So between Season 1 and Season 4, I was working in China, but I sort of retired at the end of Season 4. And in Season 5, I was basically off, not doing anything. And I had the bright idea at the time that if I did VOD reviews on YouTube and if I did articles on Reddit, I might be able to spread strategic and coaching knowledge around the community and improve the knowledge of the community as a whole.
Did it work out? Because I mean, I have to say, I only just knew who you were recently, and as far as I can tell, the only other person who knew you were alive was Kelsey.
I think I learned that maybe that wasn't the best way to sort of spread knowledge.
He frequently gets offered women in Brazil, so it's all about context and where you're from. You know?
Okay.
But in Season 5, I didn't think I was going to be coaching League anymore. I thought I'd retired for good. And so I basically did a lot of VOD reviews on EU LCS because I was in Europe at the time. Just in my spare time, just, as you say, for fun.
Yeah.
Because
Listen, I don't know why everyone. That's one of the. There's two. Here's a little side rant. Okay, so there's two things that piss me off. One is that everyone in the modern world, okay, watches, for example, superhero movies, Marvel comic book movies. They watch science fiction shows. They watch comic books that are made into TV shows, and because of that, everyone in the world tries to claim the identity of nerd, right? None of these people are nerds. Like, liking the Star Wars mainstream movies does not make you in any measure a nerd. That is not, like, there's a certain sort of, it's like the 12 tasks of Hercules, you know, there's certain toils you must undergo and suffering that must occur before you are actually a nerd, you know. It's not something you have choice, just vocationally decide you're going to do with your life, you know. It's a path you're initially forced down, and then, as the great Trent Reznor said, the way out is through. So you just go through that into some other aspect of your life. So, nothing wrong with looking up stuff like that. Listen, mate, I've literally, no job. I said this in a video I did in CSGO where someone asked me what was the worst job I had. So it was in esports. I used to literally manually enter scores into a database that, you know, nowadays a simple bot could just pass the server log and do this. I manually entered them all for thousands and thousands of man hours. And here's the best detail. A year ago, they updated that website and just wiped the whole database. So, my toil was literally for nothing. I literally am now facing the same rock at the bottom of the mountain. Look, I don't have to push up the hill anymore. Got other fuckers to do that for me. So, okay, you were watching these VODs for fun. Here's the first question I have. Could you actually tell, be honest here, because by the way, if you can, fair play, we'll give you credit. Could you actually tell from the first early games how good that team was? Like, were they polished out the gate? Because obviously they just brought Reckless back, right?
Sure. Compared to other teams in Europe, they immediately looked pretty good. But compared to some of the other teams that, you know, I'd studied at Season 4 World and things like this, they didn't appear that good, no. They only sort of developed later as they sort of realized what their strengths and their weaknesses were and how to cover for these weaknesses in particular. I think that when we go into more detail later, I think that's the really big thing about Season 5 FNATIC. They knew how to cover their weaknesses and they knew how to play to their strengths better than almost any other team. Any other team in the West than almost any other team in the world. So
okay.
They also knew what a minion wave was, but that you could see from really early games, I think, of FNATIC was something that even from week one, it was weird because in spring, I knew that they studied a lot of the Chinese teams and they were going for more of this, like, we aren't going to set up macro, we're not going to set up objectives type thing, we're just going to brute force you. But then the FNATIC that came out of summer just was very different. It still had a lot of the aggression, a lot of the all-in comps and everything, but I think one of the interesting things that you notice right away is that they're pushing out bot wave when they're setting up for Baron. Yep. It's just a really simple concept, but it's something that almost no one else in EU LCS was doing at the time. So
it's something which several teams currently in EU LCS don't recognize all the time.
Sure.
But I think that just looking back, actually, when I sort of look back on these games, I was actually surprised at how far ahead of their time they actually were. Because maybe because of the passage of time, maybe because of Huni and Reignover's sort of period in Immortals, who didn't have good macro and didn't understand how to push a bottom wave and sort of didn't understand how to play around their strengths and weaknesses. FNATIC did. Like, Season 5 FNATIC were extremely good at these sorts of things. They understood minion wave control. They were a strategically sophisticated team. And sort of Huni and Reignover's career afterwards has maybe impacted how we remember sort of Season 5 FNATIC when, you know, Season 5 FNATIC were far, far ahead of Season 6 Immortals. But we remember the Huni and Reignover from Season 6 Immortals rather than Season 5 FNATIC. Okay,
so when you say the line before, it's obviously a great kind of line to dig into, where you say, like, they knew their strengths, but they also knew how to cover their weaknesses. Now, I think that's obviously a very telling comment, because unfortunately, due to their dominance in that particular split, the actual storyline pretty much from everyone was like, what weaknesses? They have the 5 best players, you know, the best player at every position, and they just win every game and no one can touch them except, you know, maybe you could hope Origen had a chance, or if you remember, Gambit started coming on late. So people actually at the time thought they'd just like solved League of Legends in Europe or something. What do you mean when you say like they could, like, let's pinpoint for, so what were the strengths of the team? What were the things that they tried to play to?
So in terms of strengths, they had very good map rotations. They knew how to play sort of, I guess I would call this a hybrid aggression reactive style. So by this I mean they would pick sort of lots of disengaged champions. They pick Janna, they pick Gragas, and they would just play super aggressively in a 4-1 system, playing with those disengaged champions. They would go hyper aggressive, and because they had the disengaged champions, if they ever got picked, they would always be able to disengage. So one thing that they sort of pioneered in Season 5 is this sort of idea as using Janna as almost a primary facilitator for the team, whereas we normally think about Janna as a disengaged champion. I think mechanically they were extremely good, although rather than talking about Reckless, Febiven during that season had one of his best seasons. Huni was obviously exceptionally good, and whereas Reckless and Yellowstar were tended to play a bit more passive, they were very good at swapping them out of lanes and being able to nullify this weakness. So in a situation where they were 2 versus 1, Yellowstar was extremely good at roaming, and rather than fighting 2v2 situations where they would be out, where the other team would have a mechanical advantage to be able to get the push, they would swap out of these situations and just let Yellowstar control the map and dominate the map in a way that he wouldn't be able to in a 2v2 situation, and wouldn't be able to in the sort of modern day meta where lane swaps aren't really viable. So they were very good in the lane swap, very good minion wave control, and sort of played aggression without all-in aggression, if that sort of makes sense.
So at the time, I was watching a lot of LPL and a lot of EU LCS, and both, like, the biggest thing that stood out to me about Fnatic and EDG was the similarity they had, which was making sure that they pivoted the game on like 20-minute or 25-minute barons, and being sure they had the waves prepped to do that sort of thing. So I think for me, that's the thing that stands out the most to me about Fnatic. It isn't even necessarily like the way in which they played team fights or the way in which they did that sort of thing. It's like, first of all, how good they were in lane swaps initially, and then, I mean, they weren't necessarily perfect in lane swaps, but because they were better than their opposition, they were really good at catching up in farm if they did make a mistake, because they would always have the waves flowing towards them. And then from there, they were really good at keeping bot side controlled so that they could make Baron plays in general. And those were the two things that stuck out the most to me about Fnatic, if you wanted to talk about their strengths particularly.
Was, like, obviously, when you consider his whole career, Huni's now been in 3 different regions. He's been in, obviously, EU with Fnatic, and then he was with the Immortals teams, which in the regular season won a massive amount of games, some ludicrous amount over those 2 splits. Obviously failed in the playoffs, and then now with SKT, on the one hand he won LCK, but then he was kind of the bench rider for most of the summer period. At that time in Fnatic, was he the star player?
I would say he was one of the star players, but I think the big difference between Huni as he developed and Huni in Season 5 is sort of, if we talk about split push, right? There's sort of 3 ways you can split push. There's I don't really know what people call them in sort of LCS, but basically the way I call them is you have hard split push, which is where you try to isolate your top laner, you put him in a 1 versus 1 situation, and you like let him take the objectives, right? You have soft split push, which is where you get minion wave control in the side lane, you push it up, and then you make sure you're in a position to rotate first for skirmishes and sort of fighting. And then you have slow push, which is what, the sort of thing that World Elite were very good at in Season 2, using minion waves to slow push. And I think that if we look at Season 6 and Season 7 Huni, you sort of have this sort of hard split pusher, carry champion, plays, Fiora, plays Jax, goes aggressive, tries to 1 versus 1 kill you. I think that the Huni that we had in Season 5 was more somebody who played for the team. He played a lot of Rumble, but he wouldn't use his Rumble to hard split. He would use it to soft split. He would make sure to be there for skirmishes in the jungle. And sometimes they would use him as a focus point for attacking top side rather than attacking top lane, if that sort of makes sense. But whereas in order to be able to do that, they needed to get pressure. They needed to get pressure mid, and I think Febiven was the key to being able to do this. So I think it was a combination of the two of them. But it was more sort of how the team attacked top side jungle together, or attacked top side river rather than as a team. So I think it's a top side of the map focused team with Yellowstar being there always being able to roam at the right times and always making sure that he would roam from bot side, and Reckless just being there to farm waves and make sure that he scaled up to the late game so that they would have a late game option.
I think something that is really telling about how Fnatic played then and how I think is rubbed off on them and how part of the team still continues to play is like there's a division of the map between top and bot side, where it was like Reignover and Huni on one side and then Yellowstar and Reckless on the other side. And the way that worked is because they almost always had mid pushed out. And so Reignover could make some of the mistakes that people famously harped on him for. Yellowstar could have some control in terms of roams, even if like part of it was that Reckless just played lane dominant utility champions, so that Yellowstar could have a lot of vision control on that side of the map as well. But I don't think any of that would have really worked if Febiven didn't always play like the Jace or the LeBlanc and then do really, really well in the 1v1 in these situations.
Yeah.
Okay. So one aspect to this team that was always interesting to me, like I referenced before, is what were the actual true weaknesses of the team? Like what were they trying to cover, or what did they identify, do you think, as potential flaws that they had to cover or shift away from?
Would you like to go first on this, Kelsey, or should I?
Sure, I can go from my perspective. I know a lot of people talked about like the number one thing that always comes out is Reignover's champion pool. And that's something that people tried to target a lot with bans. I don't necessarily think it was the biggest thing, because I think if you're targeting Reignover, he's going to get something that just farms anyway, which is kind of what he wants to do. And then after that, you end up giving like really key picks to the team, like Jace, like Callista, that they got so many games, whatever Huni wants, etc. So I think that was actually a little bit of a trap. But aside from Reignover and his positioning, I actually think that they left bottom exposed a lot, and that was something that Origen took advantage of in a few scenarios. I think that there were situations where they didn't necessarily always have the best setups for dragon fights or the best control of their jungle in general. They were a team that thought much more about controlling the map through the lanes. So if you targeted them in their jungle, it wasn't necessarily that it was Reignover. It was just that this wasn't how they thought about or how they experienced the game. I think that Huni was slow to pick up new champions, and you saw that with things like the Gangplank. Huni had like one mode of playing. I think part of the reason why Fnatic was good is almost every piece of the team had one mode of playing the game, and it fit together. But if you found a way to get them out of their comfort zone, then it was difficult for them. And that's why, like, that's part of what was covering it up, is that in a way, like, you could all see flaws for each of the pieces, but they were compensated for by the fact that Reignover was like, or Febiven had so much pressure mid, so Huni could do what he wanted top. Reckless and Yellowstar were very good at playing catch up and sideways by doing the rotation and pushing out the waves, so that Huni could always get like the free wave or the wave be correctly set up for him for him to catch the minions if he ever fell behind. So I think that situations like that made the team good, but it was also because of their weaknesses that they ended up playing the way they did.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, but I also think it's interesting that when they sort of play towards bot side, and when other teams such as Koo Tigers, which I'm sure we'll get into later, force them to play towards bot side, often they were just very aggressive in sort of fighting when they didn't need to fight. Like when they had options to trade sides, when they towards Huni rather than towards Reckless, they could do it quite well. I mean, they'd be willing to sort of they either collapse onto Huni with mid push, or they would like let Huni die and take something bot side. But whenever their bot lane was pressured, they would often just go all in, collapsing, TPing in when their top laner was behind, roaming mid when they didn't need to roam mid, when they could have just roamed top and killed the enemy top laner. And sort of they would always try to fight in situations where they shouldn't fight. I think the champion pool issue wasn't an issue in Europe, because it did give them up a lot of free picks. But one of the things that people forget about Season 5 Fnatic is, and in fact Season 5 Worlds, is that firstly, the Worlds meta was horrible. It was like, you have to ban Mordekaiser every single game. Yes. And yeah, it was horrible. But between the quarterfinals and the semifinals of Worlds, Gragas was disabled. and Gragas was a key jungler for Origen and a key jungler for FNATIC. And it meant that was a champion. You didn't have to ban against him. It wasn't a fallback champion. And it meant that you had Reignover sort of in that semifinals playing Skarner against Koo Tigers, who are a team who want to scale up and have a really hard time dealing with the early game. And so whilst it didn't hurt them as long as the meta stayed as it was, because they were unlucky or because, whatever coding system or things like this, it actually ended up hurting them at the end. And sort of our final memory of FNATIC is obviously the 3-0 loss to Koo, but they wouldn't have lost 3-0 to Koo if Gragas hadn't been disabled in that series. They would have definitely been able to put up a better fight. And, it didn't hurt them, but it did hurt them in their final sort of series. Also, I think Yellowstar and Reckless had issues, especially against Gambit 2v2 in late. Like Edward and Forgiven would just beat them 2v2. And in games where Yellowstar couldn't roam and they couldn't leave Reckless by himself, it created, sometimes their aggressive plays would work out because Yellowstar would always be there roaming, so they'd always have a 4v3 on that side of the map. And because Gambit in particular were very good at forcing them back and stopping Yellowstar roaming, they sometimes lost the safety net, which they would have had otherwise. So.
I think, it's telling that they almost never initiated the swap, and by that I mean they didn't send their 2v2 top first, but they almost always got lane swapped on because the fact that teams were targeting like Reignover's champion pool, so they would get strong side lane matchups, so the enemy team would feel like they had to lane swap against them. But FNATIC were really vulnerable in standard lanes because of part of what you just said with Reckless and Yellowstar in the 2v2. So.
Okay, so I wanted to actually know what you thought then about the impact of Yellowstar on this team, because if you remember kind of the chronology, when he was in the Season 4, and obviously he was there in Season 3 as well when he switched to support, there were so many other star names in the team, Expeke, Soaz, etc., that, yes, he was considered one of the best supports in the West, in Europe, etc., but it was actually this Season 5 team that really elevated his legacy, his status, because obviously the spring team was the one where no one knew these guys. I mean, I've actually even told this story that literally they told me basically all those players when they wanted me to be coach of FNATIC, and I was like, yeah, well, it's been real, see you later. And although I will tell this, I did give them one good tip, which is that they did say well, who the fuck are we going to get as a coach? And I did say, do a public post where you just gather as many applicants as you can, and if they hadn't have done that, they would have never gotten Daylor, because no one knew who the fuck this guy was. So one thing I will say though is the point is Yellowstar, when he came back to that team, that was a risk. The rumor was he was actually thinking of just retiring outright. He came back instead. You have to remember in the spring split, he didn't have Reckless. He had Steel back at the time, who was a complete nobody, basically came from Challenger Series. Then he had rookie Febivan, who obviously had choked a whole bunch of fucking times on LAN. He had Huni, no one knows from his career. I don't care who tells you that they knew that guy was good. They didn't. Shut the fuck up. I was actually there at the time, And then Reignover was considered a failed player. So when he then took that team and then they overcame their gradual rise in the split and they won the eventual LCS split, unsurprisingly, a lot of people were like, wow, what a great player Yellowstar is. He must have had so much impact on shot calling and being kind of the veteran presence. So then you come into summer, obviously, yes, he gets Reckless back, who he has a history with, he's played with him before. But the problem is, I feel because of that period where Yellowstar went to TSM and was under the microscope and it didn't go well because they didn't win the season and they had their issues, and then was playing with a very demanding player and in double lift, people ever since that split onwards and his return to FNATIC have really kind of rewritten history. Suddenly all the people who thought he was amazing in Season 5 and the best support ever in the West, they've really come back off that almost as though they feel burned by it, In this Season 5 summer team, what do you think of Yellowstar as a player and his impact? I mean, you've talked about some of the potential weaknesses and strengths, which is, weak in lane potentially, but good at roaming.
Yep. So the thing about Yellowstar in Season 5 is that I've never seen a player do more by doing nothing, which may sound a bit like an insult, but basically the thing that made Yellowstar really, really good is he would play around vision. If he saw you place a ward, he would know where that ward was. If he wanted to try to make you make a play topside, he would show himself bot side on your ward, which he'd seen you place. And then he would disappear. There was one game against FNATIC where he deliberately appeared on a ward. Against Gambit where
Yes,
he
okay.
deliberately appeared on a ward that had been placed, immediately went back to lane, showed himself in lane, hit a minion for his relic shield proc, disappeared into a bush, and immediately recalled, having shown himself both in lane bot and on a ward that he'd seen Gambit place. And then there was a 3v3 skirmish top, and he was there, having basically set up a bluff. I guess you could call it a bluff. He'd shown Gambit for basically 1.5 minutes. I am bot side of the map. You can do something on the top side of the map. I'm not roaming, honest. And then he would appear top. And I think that he was also very good at recognizing when he had opportunities to roam, sort of, and was in a time when sort of who would you have said was the second best support in Europe at the time? Edward?
Mithy.
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 You had Kissing as well. He was
Yeah,
pretty good.
true. Where all of these supports were sort of really good, mechanical, very good 2v2 supports, could sort of playmaking supports. Yellowstar didn't need to do that to beat you. Yellowstar wouldn't fight you. He would just rotate around your vision. He would make sure he was in the right place at the right time, and he would just win with making sure there was a numbers advantage whenever Fnatic wanted to fight. Whereas, Kissing, Edward, Mithy, they would all just beat you 3v3, right? But Yellowstar would never need to beat you 3v3 because he'd always be the extra guy who would show up there when you were trying to force a 3v3 fight and make sure that there was a numbers advantage. And I think at TSM, he never got the opportunity to do this because they wanted him to play a more 2v2 role bot lane. They wanted a support who could fight the 2v2, who could dominate in lane. And that's never from season 5 onwards at least, that's never who Yellowstar really was. He was a guy who would outsmart you on the map and out-rotate you on the map.
Okay. I think, and when they brought him back to Fnatic after that, they were in a position where they had to get a pressure lane somewhere because they were putting Febiven on kind of these less dominant lane champions, and their top lane situation was a mess. So they tried to really have the 2v2 lane with Reckless and Yellowstar that you could maybe argue they had to an extent in season 4 spring or something of that nature, but since then had never really ever existed. So they tried to actually finally make that a reality, and we saw the weaknesses that were covered for a while, which is just that wasn't what they were good at as a duo lane, was the 2v2. And so that also just worsened his reputation. He probably also by that time had a lot of morale, had a lot of issues with motivation and everything else, and ended up retiring. But I do think that some of what Yellowstar was good at has been called into debate, was he even a shot caller, all these other things. But what you can look at in game specifically is the roaming and the vision pressure that he created, but also just he was really good at pulling trigger and engages. And that's why for me, I always remember him as the Annie player. So I think that when you had a champion that wasn't super complicated mechanically, that was when the guy was at his best, because he could always find the right target. He could always find the right fight to start. And against SKT at MSI, right? This was the thing that Fnatic were super good at. So,
yeah.
Okay. Because one of the, when you, on that topic then, of if someone's the shot caller or what their role is, obviously beyond people telling us things, and even then you have to pass who's full of shit and who's just saying something publicly, obviously, we can never truly know unless you're inside the team, all anecdotes that you've heard from people. But I will say this, there are a lot of cases where I think you can kind of by process of elimination figure out how much someone did. So a great example, okay, I'll give you a classic example, another Season 5 example. So in Season 5 Spring was when they had that SK Gaming team, which was N-Rated and Forgiven and Fox and Svenskeren and, and this was a team, right, where the year before they'd had a much weaker lineup without kind of star players to the same degree, but they'd had very good macro pretty much the whole time. And one of the things that N-Rated was always hailed for, it was a very intelligent, very cerebral player as a support player. Funnily enough, had his own failings as a laning support as well. But when he came into this era, I remember any time I would ever bring up the fact that he was a shot caller or some element of him was what was making them good, even his own team would all claim, no, this is all false. You've made that up. We all shot call. We're all equally good at shot calling. So all I'm going to say is this, okay? I ran the experiment because I allowed you to live your lives and have careers. So I saw Svenskeren after he left SK. He was absolutely in no sense a cerebral player. I saw the Fox guy after Forgiven left. He was non-existent. He was just an average mid laner. Freddy122, I could believe in his own very unique way, has some sort of a good gauge on the game. He seemed like he had a decent read. You look at the rest of the team. Jezis, when they had him as the mid laner, didn't really buy the idea that he was some mastermind. You know, you take apart the other pieces. Yes, maybe they played a role in a gestalt shot calling, but it helped that you had this guy who sort of universally across, 4 or 5 different rosters was hailed as one of the smartest players. That doesn't seem like a coincidence. So likewise, when I try and pick apart the Yellowstar in FNATIC equation, I look at the fact that first of all, he already won LCS without Reckless, so it's not like he needed Reckless to understand any of the concepts of what he was doing bot lane. Then you look at the fact that, yes, during the time they had this team, you could also have said, hey, maybe Reignover has like a decent role in this. But when I saw Reignover go to Immortals, as far as I can tell, Reignover's genius was he knows exactly what to do with Huni. Doesn't really seem, when I've looked at him since then, like he's this, that can read everything about the game and knows exactly what, you put him with some not very good teammates, he doesn't seem to do a whole lot, So I think once you pick the team apart, it feels like he has to have had a pretty integral role, especially because the more I've learned about Daylor, the less it seems like he was like an X's and O's analyst type coach. It seems more like he was the coach in the sense of actual coaching, like this is how we're going to practice and this is the way we're going to set things up and I'm going to set up a hierarchy of communication. So ultimately, you do the process of elimination. It feels like Yellowstar's the only one left, really, who could have been one of the key impetuses to this intelligent way to play the game. Disagree? Come at me if you do. Come on.
And the team, to an extent, does really give him a lot of credit, at least for having some kind of leader role. The thing that I've kind of heard about Yellowstar that seems the most plausible from people that have worked for him is that he isn't necessarily the most decisive shot caller, right? He'll say something like, we should do this. So you really have to have like the buy-in for the team for him to be effective. So on a team like TSM or something, if he's saying something like this and then you have 4 people talking over him, he's probably not gonna be the main shot calling voice on a TSM. But on a team where people are like, yeah, this guy is our captain, he brought us together, what he's told us to do has worked out. We've got a bunch of rookies on this team. Reignover obviously has good English, so he can communicate with him and everything like this. So Reignover is a good backup and everything else. But generally speaking, like we believe in this guy, then I think he'll be effective in that setting.
Yeah, but also that FNATIC put the structure in place to back him up. I mean, like he didn't have to be that voice. I mean, Daylor could be there to knock some sense into Febiven when. Or the other rookies when they sort of disagreed, and I think that in other sort of teams, including when he came back to FNATIC, that was sort of not really the case either because his TSM experience. Well, because TSM didn't. That's not how TSM does shot calling. But also after he'd been to TSM and sort of failed in TSM, he never had that sort of authority again to sort of make those sort of shot calling decisions. But I mean, I think that the best sort of thing I can say about Yellowstar is that the game, League of Legends, has evolved a huge amount, in terms of how people approach the game, how people think about the game, how people understand the game. But even though we're 2.5 years into the future, when I'm teaching a support from solo queue to be a competitive support and to make the transition, I will still show them VODs of Season 5 Yellowstar and his roaming and his pressure play. Just because that's the best way you can sort of teach somebody. You do not have to be the star. You do not have to be the main playmaker to just win games of League of Legends. You can just be the best support in the world and do nothing and just win the game doing nothing. And I think that is sort of the best sort of epitaph we can put on Yellowstar's career, even though people may not see that as a compliment. But to me, it's the best compliment of all. Like, why fight when I can just beat you without fighting? I can just like look at you and you lose. And I think that's his legacy.
Okay. So one aspect of this team, is that obviously in the regular split, they did the undefeated run. They had the 18-0. This is back when we started the best of ones. Obviously, we weren't into any best of X situation. Now, as a wider question, Do you think they actually should have been undefeated? I remember there was late in the season a very famous game. I think it was against Origen, right, where they essentially like had to do a massive comeback. And Origen, it was claimed, a lot of people said Origen kind of threw the game or something along those lines. Do you think, was it legit? Like, were they clearly the best team? Was it reasonable that they went 18-0?
In Europe, I think, yeah, you have to say they were the best team. Even when Origen was able to identify their flaws, like Origen was sort of playing with the idea of beating them. And that already right there tells you like what it is. So even if Origen had won there, I think if Origen had won the final, you could probably say, yeah, maybe Origen is the best team. But the fact that Origen, in their way of beating them, was specifically targeting them, which isn't necessarily something I felt like Fnatic ever did against their opponents or anything like that, I think that definitely is very telling about how powerful and how strong Fnatic were within the context of EU LCS at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were clearly the best team, but I think they were lucky to go 18-0. I mean, I think that they could easily have gone 16-2 or 15-3 or something like this. And there were definitely games where teams, because they got so close to breaking the 15-0 Fnatic run or beating the 16-0 Fnatic run, sort of almost choked under the pressure of being able to be recognized as the team who
they didn't know how to back and buy items. And
I mean,
like, oh, we just aced them. We should int in their base now.
Yes. Or there was the H2K game where H2K were like 7,000 gold ahead of them and couldn't close the game because they would just keep getting picked over and over again, and they almost seemed to have forgotten how to play League once they got that lead. But yeah, I think that definitely they were by a mile the best team in Europe. And I think even if that team was transported into modern day sort of season 7, EU LCS, they would, no, not the players, I mean the players as they were in season 5, they would, be a top 2 or 3 team in Europe, even though things have developed so far in terms of strategic knowledge internationally.
That's where I might disagree with you a little bit, is because I do think that Fnatic then did a lot of things really well that even now would be useful. But at the same time, I think that because of the grasp of information that they had, also the fact that we no longer have lane swaps, a bunch of other factors like this, I think it would be a lot harder for them. Like, one thing that was really telling for me is that a lot of times, especially early on in the summer, they kept trying to play like these Gnar, Alistair, Ashe comps, and it's like, we will get ahead in the first stage of the leg of the swap, and then we'll do the second leg of the swap, and we'll dive you. And this should theoretically set Huni really far behind, but because you don't know how to bounce the bot wave, he's just going to be happy, and he's just going to get the farm there, and your top laner is going to be screwed anyway. So I think that, yeah, there were a lot of things that they relied on that I think EU LCS teams are a little bit better at now, which is like, if there were lane swaps, I think basic balancing of waves was something that maybe top 5 did towards the end of the 2016 season. So
yeah, but still a lot of teams in Europe messed up bounces even into season 6. So maybe, but no, definitely like the elimination of lane swaps definitely made it. You're right.
So during that split, when you were looking like who's the team that's going to beat them, obviously in terms of the rankings, like Origen was really high up, so people, they had a chance, and they obviously had superstar players who had won LCS before. H2K, at that point, you have to remember, this is the pre-Forgiven, pre-Yankos team. It was the one with Lunex and Harnan. So that was the team where like they had some good players and they had some good macro, but like there was a reason why they didn't win LCS. I always thought they were a little bit underpowered. So we had what became one of the greatest cock tease scenarios ever in the history of the LCS. And it goes like this. Everyone will forget, okay, that one little area of drama, that entire split, was that the spring split MVP, Forgiven, was on Gambit. And when he joined Gambit, he naively thought, I'm joining Gambit, playing with Edward, really aggressive support, playmaking support. It's my dream, right? Little did he know, no, mate. Gambit is a team that has Diamond Proxy, and he only ganks the top lane, and their star player plays in the top lane. And guess what? Their coach is also from the same country as the star player and thinks they should only gank the top lane. So half the split, okay, was Forgiven fighting internally with them, and then like playing in like a totally different manner in the games. He even played Sivir at certain points in times and trying to like battling almost for himself. Like, was he going to force himself to be the old forgiven of old and make them bend to his will, or was he going to try to show that he could be versatile? And the worst thing ever, obviously, is that they actually started to kind of find a balance between the two. Like, they still went top a lot, but now the bot lane was getting very good. And the word from Scrims, and this wasn't just a few people, I heard it from multiple people on different teams, was that Gambit was actually, outside of Fnatic, the best team in Scrims. They were wrecking everyone, and everyone, as you referenced before, because one of the few weaknesses potentially was 2v2 laning of Reckless and Yellowstar, everyone was like, they're the team that can do it. But obviously, just as that all kind of crystallized into this moment where it was going to happen, Forgiven got banned for like 93% report rate of toxicity, and the games that he was banned for scuttled their chances of making it into the playoffs, and it all just basically was a massive cocktails and ended like that. Right? Do you actually buy the thing? Like, could Gambit have been the team to beat them, do you think?
Well, they did beat them in one game or something like this. I think, I can't remember, was it best of 2 or best of 3? I think it was best of 3 at the time, right? But I definitely remember.
No, they didn't. They went 8-0.
No, sorry, I'm confused. No, I'm mixing it up with a different thing. No, but there was one game where they
were very close to the game, I believe. Yeah,
they were really close. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, which one was that? Was the one where he was on Hecarim, right?
Yeah. Let me see. Which game was it? I have it. Actually, it was just
week 6.
Yeah, it was a Hecarim game. You're right.
Game. Yeah. And they had a really large lead in that game, but because they were a bit greedy, one or two times too many, like eventually Fnatic came back. I mean, I don't know if Gambit. I think Gambit would have qualified for Worlds that year, right? As a top 3 seed.
I think they could have, yeah. For sure. I think Gambit could have at least beaten H2K or something like this and made it as a top 3 seed. It would have been kind of sad if it was like Gambit over Origen.
Yeah.
That probably would have ended up being the scenario, but I think, yeah, they probably could have made it. I don't think that they were necessarily the team that was going to beat Fnatic, because I think they still suffered from like a lot of the patience issues.
Mid lane was a really bad.
Yeah, mid lane was a bad matchup. We talked about how important Febiven is to the scenario. So,
I mean, I think that basically the big advantage that Gambit had specifically against Fnatic versus, say, against other teams in EU LCS was that the fact that Gambit went top against Fnatic didn't matter that much, because generally Fnatic liked to play towards the top side of the map. So Forgiven didn't have to play 3 versus 2 or 4 versus 2 in lane. He could just play 2 versus 2. They could get the push. Edward could roam well. He understood how to roam. And then they would split the map 3 versus 3 top side and 2 versus 2 bot. But because they could punish Fnatic's 2 versus 2 play, they could stop Yellowstar roaming and roam themselves, which would allow them to get a 4 versus 3 numbers advantage stop. So I think that... Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I also remember specifically, like, they had almost a one-off strategy where they gave Cabochard blue buff at level 1. Yeah. So he was level 2 and he went into lane, and then Huni wasn't really able to contest the wave as well. And then they had a teleport play on the 2v2 on top of that. So they had the top laner with an advantage, the 2v2 winning, and then it snowballed from there. And I think that like the blue buff on Hecarim is a little bit of a specific scenario that they may not have been able to replicate many times again and again. But yeah.
Sure. But definitely I think of the teams in sort of EU LCS, they were the only ones who really sort of, well, I mean Origen and then with the...
Yeah.
So, okay. Obviously, people forget they went 18-0, but then they also were primed. They were going into the finals undefeated as well, and people thought, are they going to run the whole gamut? But obviously, they lost 2 games to Origen. But I want to ask this, okay? So obviously, Origen had been battling the whole season. I'd been trying to figure out ways to beat them. You have to add in the context whenever you point this out, that this was actually when Gangplank was...
Yep.
On the one hand, super broken, but not everyone could play it. And obviously in this series, So I showed us he could play it. Was that a factor in Origen's like kind of closing the gap?
I think it was a factor for sure. It was what I mentioned before when I said I think Huni is a little bit slow sometimes to pick up new meta picks. So this was this was a demonstration of that. I think the fact that, like, normally you don't want to play around top against Fnatic, but you could in this scenario because of the way the matchup went with the Gangplank and the fact that Soaz was able to win Gangplank and then reverse Gangplank matchups against Huni. So,
I mean, I think the big thing was that he knew how to do the ghost barrel thing, right? Which seems almost today, just the standard thing which even gold players can do on Gangplank and solo queue. But at the time was a really big sort of, I guess, innovation that sort of Soaz knew how to do, which Huni couldn't, which meant that they could win that matchup. But
okay,
I think it definitely was a key factor.
So when we went to Worlds, I'll just start right off with one of my standard provocative questions. How the fuck does a team that goes almost undefeated in EU LCS lose to High, the shot-calling jungler who couldn't play any jungle champions and just did one fast push strat? How? How could it happen?
I mean, do you want to take this one?
Nah, you can go first.
I think part of it also was just that I remember a lot of these series was, and the way the team explained it afterwards was like, it wasn't necessarily Huni, it was the fact that they were making these types of calls where they weren't necessarily on the same page, and then Huni would go in and Cloud9 would be prepared for that to like intercept Huni trying to be over eager. This is like how I remember the game specifically. And then Balls was on a really super snowballing champion that you get like one kill and then suddenly cannot control the Darius, right?
Yeah, it was Darius.
Yeah. So that's basically, I think, what happened in that particular game. But
I mean, it was basically like an extremely disrespectful sort of draft. I mean, at the time they drafted a full engage composition into what was the best disengaged tank in the entire game and an Azir. And rather than trying to split, they just continually jumped into them over and over and over and over again. So I think that actually
like Yasuo, right? Yeah. Oh.
But like I think that ironically, Thorin may have said, how did they lose to High? But I think if it wasn't High and if it was a better jungler, then they may have actually played a bit more respectfully and split up that map. So I think it was the fact that it was High and Bulls that meant that they just played disrespectfully and played super aggressively and just died because they played against the enemy players rather than the enemy composition. Okay. And then they just, got destroyed.
So obviously in the playoffs, they had what was obviously a disappointing moment for Kelsey, where EDG, it wasn't good, was it? Like, everyone remembers the first game, because the first game was the Jace teleport, AD carry, deft, failing to just end the game, basically. But beyond that, was EDG just completely outmatched? I mean, this is obviously the series where also people who didn't watch China were like, wait, so some guy who used to be a support plays top lane for EDG and he's trying to play versus Huni, Like, it seems that from the outside, people think EDG never had a chance.
I mean, that was actually, they had Koro won, and this was
you're right.
different.
They brought him back from being ill, right?
Yeah, after Amazing J was a disaster, and then Koro won.
I'm thinking the wrong year, yes.
There was like a bunch of weird stuff happening with Koro behind the scenes, but it was like, the point was that ultimately he had like one champion, and I don't blame the series on this, but Koro had like one champion, which was the Fiora, and it was really successful in the first game. Like, actually, Clearlove and Koro won in the first game. A lot of people remember them as getting completely outclassed, but in the first game they exposed a lot of weaknesses of the Huni and Reignover duo and exploited some of Huni's tendencies in lane really well, and the game snowballed. And then they had a lot of difficulty closing out like their strategy with Jace teleport. It was very clear that they weren't used to it. Everything else in that scenario, but then after that, like, they had this second game where the Gragas was banned pivotally, and I think also they just played a lot of they tried to play like these weird early game strategy comps as well initially, and that didn't work, so they went for like the Kassadin, I remember famously at the end. It was a really weird set. You could see it kind of like they knew that going in they only had maybe one strategy that was effective, and they lost that game, and then after that it was just kind of done.
But I mean, it was also, like, I mean, it seems a bit of a cop out to say, oh, it was tilt, but you could clearly see that EDG were not on full strength for whatever reason in the first game, because there was a team fight where Def TP to a ward right in the middle of a team fight when he was obviously attempting heal and things like this. But I think also in the first game, EDG showed a way you could beat Fnatic, which is that they had, it was a TP, no, it was TF mid, right? Okay, let me go. Yeah,
I think
TF,
it was TF there.
It was
TF Fiora.
Yeah. It was so they sort of created a way that even without sort of pressure, they could brute force rotations. So one of the things which made Fnatic really good is that they would get the push in the lane, they would soft split on you, they would rotate first, they would always be there to have a numbers advantage. And sort of EDG said, okay, we're not going to go and contest your sort of push, we're going to give you the push and we're just going to brute force. And whenever you try to rotate, if you try to play a rotation style on us, we're going to TF there, and we're going to be able to brute force your rotation. And I think that is something that Koo sort of saw and made it one of their objectives to put into their team compositions when they played in the semifinals. And this was something which other teams in Europe hadn't really sort of seen. So although EDG didn't have a successful series against Fnatic, they sort of showed a way forward that maybe teams could exploit them, and they learned basically. Other teams.
First of all, as a preface, obviously the Chinese teams were bad at this tournament. Like, I'm not trying to say that EDG should have won this. I actually predicted that Fnatic would win after group stage, and like I felt like they deserved to win, and they were the better team and everything like that. But also, I do think that you make a good point, and that's something we haven't really talked about, which is that globals were good against Fnatic just because they were a way to kind of like almost rotations for dummies. And I remember even like a very famous Giants game where Giants of all teams almost beat Fnatic in the regular season. And you had the mid laner playing Ezreal, Pepinero, and then like every time they tried to get like the soft push, he could fix it with the Ezreal ult. And so that worked really well for them. They also had the Shen so that they could kind of brute force fights or catch up if Fnatic tried to make a rotation and they were behind. So I think that kind of strategy was also effective against them, and the TF was useful against them by EDG as well, like he said, for that very reason as well.
And that was one of the big things about about Origen as well with the Gangplank, because Gangplank let them reset all these. Fnatic would spend 3 minutes setting up the waves really nicely so they could get a rotation or a double rotation, and then Gangplank would ult the wave, and they wouldn't do anything. So I think that maybe that was the way, but nobody really saw that as a way forward until sort of EDG really pointed it out to them in this series as a potential to exploit.
So when we got to the semi-finals, the fact that they were facing Koo, now here's another example of where you have to like put it in historical context, because people know like next year Koo Tigers fucking fantastic, or it could have won Worlds, had upgraded and gotten Peanut. This was the Koo Tigers where they didn't have Peanut, and Kuro had more issues at the time, and all of the team was very good, but they hadn't quite reached the same ascendancy as they had now. For example, people will forget this now and will rewrite history, but going into that Worlds, I didn't see anyone say Smeb was the best top laner. I always thought he was the best top laner because I'm totally biased to people who are like mad lane duelists, basically. But at the time, Marin was on SKT and everyone used to suck his dick and say he was a shot caller, which was actually completely false. And then famously, Someday had taken KT Rolster, which was a pretty bad KT Rolster, to the finals of LCK. So actually, he was maybe battling for second best in a lot of people's minds. But you came into this Koo series, and a lot of people thought Fnatic was going to win this series. And at the time, the logic went, right, if you believe Fnatic's going to win, then you probably think Febiven can somehow outdo Kuro, and that's like a position that can be a strength for them, have better jungling. If you think Koo's going to win, then you think it's because Smeb is going to be better than Huni. So that's the reason why I thought Koo was going to win, because I thought to myself, right, talk all the shit you want about Kuro if he's playing the best Korean mids. He still did pretty much hold his own, or like not just completely shit the bed. Well, okay, hold his own is different. I mean, he could play against people who are much better than me, unless they were faker, basically. So actually his job, pretty much his everyday existence was, I'm going to lose lane to most of these people, so my job is to make it not as bad as it could be. I'm not going to feed, and the rest of the team will win as the game because we're one of the best teams. So I never really bought the angle that Fnatic had like a big edge here. What, did you actually think Fnatic could beat them?
I'm still surprised Fnatic lost 3-0. Okay. Even 2 years later, like I think Fnatic were smarter than Koo, and the reason that Koo were so successful is that they would just sit back and be a punching bag and punish you when you made mistakes. But especially in the first game, Fnatic got a massive lead. It was almost a 10,000 gold lead. It was something like an 8,000, 7,000, 8,000 gold lead, and made a couple of bad team fight decisions where they fought 3 versus 5 and 4 versus 5, and then they lost. And this was, Koo Tigers were only in the game for as long as they were because there was a skirmish near bot lane, and Riven got 3 kills on the skirmish, which meant that Fnatic, who drafted a composition which should have been able to get pressure in 3 lanes at one point in the game, no longer were able to get pressure in their top lane. Because the Riven versus Hecarim matchup was swung really heavily by the fact Riven got 3 kills in the fight. And in that situation, in that team fight, I think their jungler, who was Rek'Sai, got 4 kills, and Riven got 3 kills in the fight. And if any of those kills, 3 of those kills had gone on to Hecarim, or 3 of them had gone on to their mid lane LeBlanc, I think that would have gone different. And I think that sometimes, we have to be a bit careful when we talk about luck in League of Legends, right? I mean, obviously, strategy is really important and things like this. But and over a course of a season, luck doesn't matter at all. But in an individual game, I think luck had a factor in that game. And I think that in Game 2 of the series, luck was a big factor as well because Gragas was disabled, and that really hurt them very heavily on when Fnatic were red side because they were forced to ban Elise. And that meant that Koo Tigers could ban Rek'Sai, and there was no more Gragas pick. So they were denied a lot of the picks that were strong. So I actually think they were a bit unlucky in the series, but Koo were definitely a team who were capable of playing from behind.
I felt like Koo was going to win just because I felt like they had the same kind of strong utility bot lane MO that Fnatic did. And though it wasn't, I felt like the world's meta in 2015 was actually Kuro's ideal meta because it was double teleport, mid kind of run around. Maybe it was okay, like people hadn't figured out that it's okay to give up mid pressure sometimes. It's not really okay to give up mid pressure sometimes, and so it was like they could make up for it in side lanes a lot. And I felt like that was a good setup to beat Fnatic, so I kind of felt like Koo had an advantage anyway. But yeah, ultimately it really was just like the team fighting that got to them. So I didn't really correctly assess the match either way.
What did you think of Huni then deciding he'd show us how Riven is played? Getting baited into that a little bit. In the semi-final of World Championship, no less. But.
Well, Huni's supposed to be famous for playing Riven really, really well in solo queue and scrims, right? But no, so let's put aside Game 3 of this series. In Game 3 of the series, I think nobody disputes Koo were much better than Fnatic. Fnatic basically, especially Huni, looked like he was playing on a very serious amount of tilt. He looked like he felt that he needed to win. Yes, he got solo killed, I think, in Game 2, but he was still useful. He still got a CS advantage. It was a matchup which scaled against him, but I mean, he still found ways to stay relevant in that matchup. But Game 2 was where Reignover's champion pool was punished, right? Good. This was the game where they couldn't pick Gragas because they were on red side. They were forced to ban, Mordekaiser, Gangplank, Elise, and they ended up on a Skarner, and there was no way that they could rescue Huni from his sort of early game problems. But Huni was still relevant. He was still good, but in the end, the champion pool was too much. They had a Skarner into Veigar. And it was almost impossible for the team to do anything. But that was a pick ban issue. I think Game 2 was decided by the Gragas thing. I think Game 1 is the interesting game because Game 1 is the game where Koo Tigers were able to match Fnatic's rotation because they willingly seeded mid, and they brute force with the cast-in TP, and they were able to just counter aggression all the time. Every single time Fnatic tried to do one of their rotations, Koo would be there with double TP, or they would be there with single TP if it was towards top, and they were able to stall the game out until they outscaled. But I think that had this been, you know, a meta with Gangplank, with Gragas available, I think Fnatic would have had more chance in game 2. They would have either been able to play Lulu or they would have been able to play LeBlanc. And I think that maybe the situation in game 3, although we're talking counterfactual history now, wouldn't have been as bad as it was. But definitely by the end of game 3, they were done. I mean, between game 2 and game 3, the fight went out for some reason.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up that the jungler matchup was really damaging because Rek'Sai was still a Reignover champion, but I think in a way he almost wasn't used to thinking like a Rek'Sai player at that time, or he wasn't as comfortable as he was on Gragas because there were a lot of, you know, it was, people famously say that this is where like game over raised his head, the old Reignover meme, where he just really went super eagerly. It was almost like he and Huni had the same problem in the series. I don't know what it was. I remember talking to the team leading up to it and then before, where they were saying that for whatever reason, they were just having a really hard time. And I think maybe it was a compounded effect of they were playing scrims. Now Gragas is denied. They're kind of beating their heads into the wall because they're losing more scrims than they were before. And so mentally they were drained going into this match as well. I still think that stylistically Koo should have been favored, but I do think that like how decisive and how damning the 3-0 was a little bit unexpected. So
I mean, it was also interesting because at that World Championships, you generally wanted to trade Elise for Rek'Sai, and Fnatic would regularly ban Elise and then be very happy playing Gragas into Rek'Sai. I don't know if this was a deliberate plan or something, or if it was just a happy circumstance, but basically if Elise was banned on red side, you were obliged to first pick Rek'Sai. And I think Fnatic were one of the best teams at the tournament on playing the non-Rek'Sai jungler into Rek'Sai, whereas a lot of other teams were not very comfortable playing any jungler who wasn't Elise into Rek'Sai at that tournament. And I think that really benefited them, of course, until Koo, because Koo basically said, we're not going to play, we're not going to pick Rek'Sai, we're not going to let you play into Rek'Sai, we're just going to ban it. So.
The secret is they didn't have a jungler, so they didn't need any. Okay, there we go. Okay, so you're obviously clearly, Peter Dunne, to this day, 2 years later, incredibly high on Fnatic. So here's the question, okay? Most people just let history lie and they say, okay, what happened. That's what should have happened. Koo beat them. Fair play. We all know Koo went on to become one of the greatest teams ever. So, since you're so high on them, you still don't understand they lost. How would they have done against SK Telecom?
They'd have lost 3-0.
What? That's a cop-out. Come on, that's a cop-out. Come on.
I think I'm still surprised Koo managed to get to the semifinals in that tournament. Like, Koo did not really impress me that tournament, and I'm still surprised they managed to win their quarterfinal matchup. But I think that SKT were a very, very strong team at the time. I think that Marin may not have been the main shot caller for SKT, but what he did do was he had a sort of... Okay, so I don't know what the main shot calling system is, but basically Marin's system was, if you come top, I'm going to get pressure top, I'm going to transfer pressure towards the rest of the map, it's going to be great for everybody.
Yeah.
In the games in LCK where his jungler didn't go top, he would just feed. He would continually play really, really aggressive.
Push without any wards.
Just push without any wards, and you know. So he may not have been he may not have been the main shot caller, but he definitely had some influence into how the team played.
In many ways, he was the forgiven of top lane.
Well, yeah. In many ways,
same ultimatum he presents you at all points in time, you know.
So I mean, you know, and in his career after SKT, he definitely had issues where he would just keep pushing top like he was on SKT, and the team would refuse to play around him, and he would feed. And basically, so I think that SKT had an extremely strong stylistic matchup because, first of all, Fnatic wouldn't have been able to get mid pressure. They would have been stuck in a situation where Faker would have been able to match Febiven, even though Febiven had a good performance at him against him at MSI. And they would have been able to they would have just put pressure top, and it would have been the same thing as Gambit, right? They would have played 3 versus 3 top side, 2 versus 2 bot side, and Fnatic wouldn't have been able to get pressure. Would have been able to get pressure mid, and they would have lost. I think like SKT were the worst stylistic matchup for a team like Fnatic. But I think that I wondered before I went back and watched all the VODs if I'd misremembered how good Fnatic were in this season compared to other teams. Because obviously I remembered Huni since then, I've remembered Reignover since then, remembered how stylistically poor in terms of macro knowledge Immortals were. And really just looking back at sort of season 5, there's a lot of things which I see which even modern day teams don't do well on the strategic side. And I think that therefore this was sort of the best team that the West has had in relation to sort of international rankings since the Koreans have come to dominate League of Legends. But it wasn't because they were mechanically strong. Yes, they were mechanically strong players, but it was because they had an understanding of minion wave control, roaming, lane swaps and things like this, which other teams just didn't have. So it meant that even if they had a bad performance, they would just out-macro you. And there are very few teams right now which can go from Europe, which can go to the World Championships and say, okay, if we perform poorly in laning phase, we're going to out-macro you, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it. And Fnatic, I think, were the only non-Korean team since maybe season 3 or season 4 who could say that and actually really mean it.
I don't know about every phase of macro knowledge, whether or not it was like the best ever. I think that Fnatic and Origen are examples of why removing lane swaps hurt Europe as a region, because I feel like that was something that European teams, or the top European teams, particularly strategically tunneled on, to the point where, but what set Fnatic apart from like H2K that could do that and Origen that could do that were the Baron setups for me, because I felt like Origen and H2K still had like the good early lane swap knowledge and the good early rotation knowledge, but they really, really lacked what Fnatic had, which was the just like the very simple task of pushing out both side lanes, having mid control, having wards in place, and being able to say, I see we've strategically made it so that we did a soft push on bot. Now your bot lane is going down and they're pushing out the wave. We'll get vision here. And now we have vision on both sides of mid. And now your AD carry is pushing out and we're collapsing on the AD carry. We just killed your AD carry and we're getting Baron because we already have control in place. It was something that Western teams, like, for whatever reason, just were not good at. And it's something that is just like almost automatic now for some of the top Korean teams. So it also was automatic then for some of the top Korean teams. And that was like the thing for me, is that they could compete with them at that level. But there were other aspects of their play that I think definitely they were weak at, in terms of if they didn't get their specific configuration. And I think it was easier than people realized to get them outside of that specific configuration. And so I think because of that, like, if people had explored that more, maybe we would have remembered Fnatic as a weaker team. So for me, it's like really hard to say this is the best Western team of all time, but I think that relative to their level and relative to the competition, like, we haven't seen a Western team who has been like that much better than the teams he's competing with, or it's competing with, in its own region. So,
do you think that they were a bit lucky that that teams in Europe were not able to exploit that, or the meta didn't change hard enough that they could exploit that as hard as?
I think that was a little bit lucky. I fall back to, like, where did it come from though? Like, how did they figure some of these aspects out, and why weren't other teams figuring them out after being exposed to them as well? Like, those were kind of my questions that I have about it. I think to an extent, like, some of the TP stuff with Huni was stuff that the rest of Europe caught up to, and it was almost like, in a way, Huni brought like a couple of things to the top lane in Europe, and then the rest of top laners caught up to it, and then Huni stopped evolving after that. Yep. Has also been a problem that Huni's had in his career. But yeah, it's a really weird situation for me, because I do think that they figured out something about minion control that other teams didn't, so we'll see.
But the thing was that at Worlds, people were able to study them in a way that they'd never been studied on the domestic level. And then that's what ended up with Koo being able to beat them, because they were able to recognize these and adapt their playstyle to handle Fnatic in a way that EU LCS teams and even Chinese teams and LMS teams were not able to do in the earlier stages of Worlds. I think that's why that's what Koo brought to the table that made it so that they were able to beat Fnatic.
And part of the reason why I kind of also disagree with you on that this Fnatic wouldn't necessarily be as good now is outside of just the lane swap scenario, is I do think you have examples of where the current iteration of Fnatic is weak is also part of where they were weak. The fact that they divided the map almost in half like this, and like Febiven was really good at getting pressure on his own. I feel like that's really hard to do now, right? It's really hard to have that kind of pressure just 1v1 as a mid laner only.
But I mean, at the same time, current day Fnatic are happy to just farm waves rather than set slow pushes and soft push and things like that. They just want to maximize their CS. So I think it's interesting in that way. But if we're talking about would they be, I think maybe having thought about it more as we've been talking, I think the big thing is that maybe a lot of the advantages that Fnatic had in Season 5 would have been adapted and changed much faster. Like when Lero went to NALCS, he was by far the best jungler, but teams learned in one split, whereas teams didn't learn in one split for Fnatic. So it let them do a lot of things. So
I think that makes sense as well.
When I said before that the Forgiven one was the biggest cock tease, actually maybe the biggest one was that we never got to see this lineup play again. They were like, oh, well, that was cool. We didn't win Worlds. So Huni and Reignover are just going to go and eat a constant diet of money from Noah Winston and just waste their time there. And, christen this new guy, Dylan Falco, who's definitely going to have a lot of success in playoffs in his career. And then what happened was, in Europe, we had G2 rise up. And you have to remember, the first G2 lineup was the one with Kikis and Emperor and Hybrid. Okay, here's the question, right? Obviously, if Fnatic had gone into Season 6 with the same lineup, they would, at one point, have had a nasty surprise coming for them where Riot basically just destroyed lane swaps and were like, sorry, Giants, suck a dick. Everyone who can't play 2v2 is dead. So that would already have obviously been problematic. But if you could have put the good G2, the Mithy, the Sven, I won't say expect is part of the good one. He is on the team. He's not part of the good part of it. I don't care what anyone tells me. Right? If we could put the classic G2, the best one, against the best Fnatic, how would they have matched up, do you think?
In Season 5 or Season 7?
In Season 6.
Before the removal of lane swaps.
Before they remove lane swaps. I would back Fnatic. I think that the ability that Yellowstar sort of had over that Season 5 Fnatic, and the sort of knowledge that they had over rotations and about playing with pressure and sort of how they played this sort of really aggressive, well, we didn't really talk about this much, but the way that they played this sort of aggressive style with disengaged champions, so that, they would sort of play aggressive, they would fight you even if they didn't know where all of your team was, in order to try to be able to brute force vision, because they knew they had these disengage options where they could just disengage if you collapsed on them as 5. I think that this was a play style which nobody really sort of were able to emulate to that degree of success. And I think that this is something which G2 never really had to play against. And I think that as long as lane swaps existed, and as long as Fnatic could find ways to get Yellowstar free and not have to suffer too much in the 2v2, I think that they would have been able to adapt well to G2, because they could have used Yellowstar's roaming to take control of mid instead of taking control of jungle, or roaming him to topside instead. So I think that they would have matched up reasonably well, although in games where G2 got the 2v2, I think they would have been able to win more consistently than Gambit were able to when Gambit got the 2v2s.
It's a really interesting question, because I think the thing that ultimately let G2 down was something that Fnatic never really had to deal with, which was how important the mid-jungle 2v2 became during Season 6, and I don't really feel like Fnatic had a mid-jungle 2v2. They had Febiven doing stuff, and then Reignover kind of farming, and I feel like that setup was almost the exact setup that sort of let G2 down after they learned a lot of the macro knowledge from Mithy and Sven and everything else. So I think that's it's a really weird scenario, but I think, God, it is actually so hard, because
it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think ultimately you would have to, I'll go with G2, just because I think that they had, even they had a better setup for Season 6, and that's part of their rise in general. And the rest of the EU teams didn't even know exactly what they were doing right. I don't even think they knew what they were doing right, because there were times where they stopped doing it and everything else. So I think that if you have like the best form of G2 and Fnatic with a slow ability to adapt to top, then and you could still get scenarios where you do have a 2v2, I think that G2 could have won. But at the same time, like Mithy himself will say, the reason why like EU started to suck after 2015 is because neither of these teams stayed together. Like the Origen and the Fnatic like both had very specific formulas for success, and you took those apart, and then they kind of sucked, and then the rest of the region didn't have anyone to sort of look up to, and H2K had all sorts of problems in Springs with visas and everything else. So
I mean, that's
like, that was
fucking
kind
rich
of
that Mithy's saying that. Like,
that's like
you're the
Mithy's
reason why.
excuse, so.
You did that. You killed them. It's
Yeah,
like, it's a shame those people died. They were your parents. It was you. You killed them.
True story. It's kind of funny that he says that, but like, yeah, I think ultimately what it was for Europe was the removal of lane swaps and how important mid jungle became. So I think that those are two things that Fnatic also would have had trouble with in Season 6. So it's hard for me to just like give them a free pass.
Okay. Is there a team, Season 6, Season 7, can be from any region, is there a team that kind of has the DNA of Fnatic, that has a similar philosophy or style of play, do you think? Who's the closest analogue?
It's hard to in this meta, right? In particular, because of the way top lane is right now. It's really hard to have that kind of philosophy. I think that also how important like the 2v2 is and having mid roam support roam mid also makes it really hard to come up with an exact analog. But if you just talk about like good Baron rotations and having good lane swaps, maybe. Like in Europe or just in general?
You told me.
Okay. That's a good point. I mean, I feel like current Fnatic is somewhat similar in a way, just because I don't think that their lane swaps are good or their rotations are good, but I think that they have the same problems. So I guess you could say that in terms of problems. In terms of strengths, I would say in terms of strengths. Wow. It's hard for some reason.
I mean, I think it's because we're looking at a modern day world in Season 7 where you cannot play this style of play and be that successful because the way that patches have worked means that it's a more AD carry focused meta. It's a game where you don't really transfer your pressure from bot lane. You often transfer your pressure to bot lane. And it means where sort of these delicate rotations and sort of nice minion wave pushes and things like this have been deprioritized in terms of in favor of 5 versus 5 pure team fighting, because Stoneplate and Righteous Glory exist. So I think
it's also because Riot secretly loves TSM. But you can give the item reasons if you want. Give the item reasons if you want.
But it makes me sad because it makes me wonder whether a team like this could exist again, because without the reason this Fnatic were able to exist, and they were sort of this 18-0 team, and they were this team that could be so successful on the international stage, was because they were able to play a style which meant that all of their players didn't have to be individual mechanical monsters. They could just play subtle play style based around rotations and things like this. And this is a style which, for which fans have said that they don't like, or where maybe Riot have said that they don't like, where they prefer to have more of these 2 versus 2, these 1 versus 1. If you're worse than your opponent 1 versus 1, you will have to suffer and you will pay. And that I think that maybe a team like this can never exist again, with their skill set, with their strengths.
If you have to pick one, if I had to pick one, I would say Longju has similar way in which like people are going to focus on the top lane monster, right? And he looks so good and stuff, but the stuff that makes Longju work is actually more subtle and much more interesting. So I would say that maybe like you could draw an analogy to Longju and some of the stuff that they do with their bot lane having like underrated pressure because they get strong utility matchups, or you have like a lot of pressure mid that people aren't necessarily acknowledging as how important it is to the team. Their jungler just like kind of is there, and he benefits from the fact that like he gets like strong lanes and stuff like this. So maybe Longju is like the leveled up spirit of Fnatic, you know, coming into 2017 World Championship. There you go.
Spiritual successor. Yeah, no, definitely the cuz. I like the cuz. But yeah, okay. I second your choice.
Hey, it's Crumbs. You're lost? How do you not know where you are? It's Thorin's channel.